Hi, it's Pastor Andy, and we are returning to our daily videos this week with a look at Romans chapter 8, beginning with Romans chapter 8. But let me give you a bigger scope first before we do that. Not from Romans particularly. We did that in last week's sermon, kind of reviewing everything. But the most important thing about teaching the Bible is trying to understand the passage that is being taught. Sometimes that is easier than others. Practice matters, training matters, experience matters. All of those things can help, but there are times that certain words, certain verses, certain passages are just very, very difficult to understand. And before this most recent break in these daily videos, I think the last ones we did were like January 16th through 19th or something like that. I showed you an example of that week in particular with trying to understand the proper interpretation or the proper background for Romans 7:13 through 25. And the week before that, I did the same kind of thing, showing the options just around the word I, the single letter I, and how that could be interpreted. But the reason it's important to study, to really try to understand the passage and study it deeply is because if we don't understand what we're reading, then how can we understand what we're teaching? Now again, that doesn't mean that we're going to do things perfectly on a passage. It doesn't mean we're going to do perfectly something on a particular verse for that matter. But we are to do our best. And again, if options exist, sometimes the best thing that we can do is to present those options like I just shared back in Romans chapter 7 a couple of times in the past. But the real goal in understanding a passage or a verse or whatever it is you're going to be teaching is to try to boil it down to one single principle. And if it is a principle, then it is a principle that is true. It's a principle if it's true whether somebody's 3 years old, 30 years old, 300 years old. It's a principle that is true 500 years ago, 500 years from now, and right now. It's a principle that is true. And so if we can narrow down on that principle, then we know the truth that God is trying to communicate in a particular verse or in a particular passage. Now, once we do that, we can craft a more meaningful lesson and the application. Now, of course, if you're teaching that principle to a 3-year-old, you're probably going to teach that differently than you would to a 30-year-old or to an 80-year-old. But the principle can be the same. Once we know it, then we can provide an entry into the lesson, we can provide an exit out of the lesson and apply some application to that process as well. So one thing that can be helpful is to try to understand, before we address an individual principle, is to try to understand how we individually, so me, you singular, how we understand the Bible. What is the overarching motif of the Bible? So what I'm going to ask you to do is just pause the video for a few seconds and just think about it. You may not come up with an answer. If you can come up with an answer, if you haven't done this before, and you can come up with an answer in just 30 seconds, wow, that's great. This generally takes weeks of reflection and stuff, but at least it'll give you some time to think. So go ahead and hit pause. I'm not going anywhere. Hit pause, and when you're ready, restart the video. Now, let me share my motif, my overarching theme. For me, it's the kingdom of God. I've heard various, and there's a lot of good ones. There's some I'm not certain where that comes from, but let me share my idea. Creation was about God bringing a new dimension of His kingdom into being. That is, the kingdom of God already existed, in a sense, before He created anything. But there was no one to know about that kingdom. There was nothing for mankind to do or for animals to live in or anything about that kingdom. So bringing about creation, creating something in a sense, made that kingdom knowable. So he made mankind to steward that kingdom. He made mankind to take care of that kingdom. That's what we see in Genesis 1. We see it being played out in Genesis 2. But then what we see beginning in Genesis 3 is that people rebelled against the king. We find later that God says, well, I'm the king, and I'm going to call a new people unto myself, and those people, I'm even going to give them a land. I'm going to give them a place to take care of and to prosper in this land. But those people also rebelled against the king, time and time and time again. And so finally we get to the New Testament, and God says, well, there's only one way to make this right. I'm going to send a servant who is my son. I'm going to send my son, and I am going to send him to restore these people, to redeem these people, to bring them back into my kingdom. Because at this point, by this point, really going back to Genesis chapter 3, there was a new king in town. And the new king, according to Paul, in Romans chapter 5, for instance, is where we kind of pick this up, is sin, who co-reigned in death. So sin and death were the conquerors at this point. Now certainly, Satan is behind the curtain pulling the strings. I understand that. But sin and death, or whom Paul says are the dominion of authority here. They are the ones who are in authority. And so God said, I need to bring my people back from that. Even though they've been taken off and carted off into captivity literally by the Assyrians and Babylonians, literally under the oppression of Rome, but there is a greater oppressor of sin and death, and so I'm going to bring them back, and I'm going to send my son to do that. And because of that, not only are we redeemed, but that initial creation is being restored, and one day will be restored in full. So again, for me, it's about the kingdom of God. And I realize one of the challenges as I teach is I have to translate in my mind, because that's the way I see the Bible. It's the way I see almost every verse in the Bible is through that lens. We don't understand kings in America. We vote. Kings aren't voted in. Kings are kings. They have rulership. They have authority. We don't get a say. We don't get to determine what might happen. The king says this will happen. We have a Congress at the state level. We have, a city council or whatever it is that you're watching. We have these different levels, and Jesus says it's me. And God sent him as the Prince of Peace, as the King of Kings, and he is our authority. So I have to make that translation. But what Jesus made possible is this another way to look at this overarching theme, and many people use this idea, is that there was creation, then there was the fall of man, then there is redemption through Jesus, and then there is restoration. So 4 words: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And in doing that, we can kind of get the overall meta-narrative, the overall narrative of the Bible, not just an individual story, but how the whole Bible fits together. That is the story of the Bible. Genesis 1 is creation. Revelation 21:22 is restoration. And we see the fall beginning in Genesis 3. We see redemption in the Gospels and throughout the New Testament. Why do I mention this now? Because Romans chapter 8, gloriously, as only God could do, covers all of that. Romans chapter 8 covers the creation. It covers the fall. It covers the redemption, and it covers the restoration. And we're going to see that in the coming weeks. That is what I look forward to unpacking for you, not only on Sundays, in a lesser way perhaps, but on our daily videos throughout the months of February and March, and perhaps even into April from Romans chapter 8.